Julianne Ginter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Green Party is interested in creating an economy that is cleaner, greener, and works for all New Zealanders, not just those who are already doing really well. And to that end, we need a simpler, fairer tax system, and we need to ensure that there aren't loopholes like the ones that have been partially driving the out-of-control housing market in Auckland. There are multiple factors at play in Auckland. One of them is the fact that we treat tax very differently on capital than we do on income that you get from, or well, we treat it differently than on labor. So people go to work, they're a nurse or a doctor, earn a paycheck, an engineer, a teacher, whatever they are, they have to pay tax on that income. But if one person buys a house and later sells it and makes $100,000, as is regularly happening right now in Auckland, no tax is paid on that income. Now there is an intention test where we say, well, if the house was purchased specifically with the intention of making a profit, then you should pay tax on it. But if you don't have that intention, one doesn't pay tax on that. So now the government's trying to ensure that people who are buying and within a short period of time selling will be subject to that tax if it's not their main home. And so there's a multi-part, there's several bills that are going to enable this to happen. So one is the Bright Line test, which is currently before Select Committee. That means that anyone who buys or sells property within 2 years for investment purposes will be subject to tax. But in order to carry this out, we needed information. The IRD in their regulatory impact statement on this bill, the Land Information Offshore Persons Bill, states that although we do have provisions that impose income tax on certain property transactions and also on rental income earned from property, it's very difficult to assess compliance because there's no linkage between the property sales transaction data and tax identification number. So this bill exists to now require a tax identification number if the person is from overseas, or IRD number here in New Zealand on all property transactions, except it doesn't. Now, it would be really useful if it did, because it would give us a lot of data. There's no real compliance costs associated with it. In the regulatory impact statement, it says that collecting an IRD number and linking that to the LIN's property sales transaction data would maybe take an extra 1 to 4 minutes for conveyancers. And it may, I think, add to the cost of the transaction $1 to $4. That's a transaction that's obviously costs a lot more than that, so it's a tiny percentage overall. But it would be incredibly useful and actually simplify our ability to the officials' ability at IRD and at LINs to understand who is buying and selling properties. So, you know, what happened here, and I'm really disappointed about this process. It has, as other members have said, it was a truncated process. And maybe it's for that reason that this bill has been changed, I think, through the process, or at least it doesn't reflect the advice provided by officials in the regulatory impact statement to exclude the main home from the IRD number, the IRD number. So I just, it's really hard to explain how unbelievable it is that the government has made the exemption for the IRD number. Yes, we understand, okay, you're making the exemption for the main home with respect to the Bright Line test, but why would you do it with the IRD number, especially when in the regulatory impact statement, IRD says that their preferred option would be for it to apply to all property sales transaction. There's no additional compliance costs. That's something members from the government and the minister have claimed, that somehow requiring the IRD number for people buying and selling their main home would add compliance costs. But the regulatory impact statement says that the compliance cost would maybe be an additional minute worth of work for conveyancers, and maybe an additional $1 to $4. And when they laid out the options requiring IRD numbers and tax identification numbers to be provided to LINs for all property transactions, that was the preferred option. And they said it would enhance Inland Revenue's ability to enforce the income tax obligations of those who buy and sell New Zealand real property. It would also help prevent non-residents from evading foreign tax on their New Zealand land sale or purchase by ensuring that the foreign tax authority can match the transaction with the taxpayer. So, it's a good idea. It makes sense. Yet, for some reason, when the bill came to Select Committee and when it came to the committee stages, it had this bizarre exemption for the main home. Now, submitters certainly didn't suggest that the main home should be exempted. We heard from the Chartered Accountants of Australia and New Zealand who said, actually, this main home exemption doesn't make sense. It adds complexity to the rules, and it means that we'll have less complete information. We heard from Ernst & Young that the exemption shouldn't be made. It made it more complex. And here in the regulatory impact statement, we see that it was Inland Revenue's preferred option to just keep it simple. All property transactions, we get the IRD number, tax identification number. Makes sense, right? But no, this government, for whatever reason, has chosen to make it more complicated, make the rules more complicated. And unfortunately, there's no reason to think there'd be any additional compliance costs. As noted above in the regulatory impact statement, it says, a conveyancer is likely to spend an additional 1 to 5 minutes entering the information into Land Online, resulting in an additional cost of between $4 and $20 for purchaser and seller. Under option 3, that's the option that the government has adopted, which was not recommended by officials, which was not particularly recommended by submitters who are experts in this area. Compliance costs will be at the lower end of the scale for those exempted, but it makes the rules more complicated, and it means that we have less information. So the benefits of collecting the information, which is the whole purpose of the bill and is the purpose of the policy that the government is implementing, is reduced under this option. So under the Bright Line test, there's a limit to how many times one can claim the main home exemption within 2 years. They can only do it twice because, as it says in the regulatory impact statement, some individuals who are purchasing their main home could still be subject to tax if they have a regular pattern of buying, improving, and selling their main home. So the way to solve that in the Bright Line test, they say you're no longer exempt from the Bright Line test if it's your 3rd time buying and selling your main home within 2 years, if it's one's 3rd time buying or selling their main home within 2 years. But of course, how would we know that? How are officials supposed to know if the buyer or seller has done it 3 times if they haven't had the IRD number linked to the property transaction for the first 2? It's a silly rule. It's a silly law. It adds complexity. It doesn't reduce compliance costs. And yet, for some reason, the government voted against my supplementary order paper, which I introduced yesterday, which would have removed the exemption for the main home from this legislation. Unfortunately, Acts David Seymour voted against my supplementary order paper, even though it was right in line with what submitters recommended, the Chartered Accountants recommended, with what Ernst & Young recommended, with what the officials recommended. So obviously the Green Party is going to be supporting the bill, but it's really a shame. It's a shame that lawmaking has come to this in this country, that the national government gives us so little time to scrutinize legislation, to actually make good law. They can't agree with other parties in the House who are simply trying to make better law. It's got nothing to do with any ideological perspective. We just want to accept the advice of officials and those of submitters and get good information. Make it easier for us to enforce tax law. And instead, very typical of this national government, you have crazy exemptions that do not make sense, that nobody recommended, that have no good, solid, factual basis for their arguments, and yet they come in here and say, oh, it's going to be less administration if we don't require people to supply their IRD number, which takes about 30 seconds. So I'm just sorry. I'm sorry that we couldn't get some cross-party agreement on what would have vastly improved this bill yesterday in the committee stages. Very, very sorry. Thanks, Mr. Speaker.